Hello everyone. I see some of the faces we saw yesterday. Gillian Polack is a renowned author from Australia, but also not only an author, but also a very gentle person. Triple doctorate 2 times and third on the way, correct, Gillian? Your third doctorate is
only
on the way?
2 doctorates. The third I'm halfway through.
A perfect cook with vast knowledge of different cuisines from the world. And this is the topic that she will be talking to us about today. It's food in science fiction, how to make it so that it still makes sense in terms of world building. Is that correct?
Sort of. I decided to do something a little bit different today, just for the fun of it. We get a lot of talks about food in science fiction and a lot of educated and thoughtful analyses of what happens. And I'm actually researching that at the moment. So I'm happy to give you a sincere and academic approach another time, but it's Sunday. And you've all been conferencing all weekend. And yes, I know a lot of that is games, but they're serious games. So you need something a bit lighter than an academic exegesis. So what I've done is taken a bunch of science fiction authors and thought, how do you find the food that's in their fiction? What sources might have influenced their fiction? And some of this I know for certain, and some I'm improvising madly. So this is just fun. Except when I say it up. If I say I know this for certain because I've talked to this person or I've analysed this person, then you can say, oh, this means something. Mostly it's to say that there are cookbooks that you can use to cook the food from almost any science fiction novel. Science fiction or fantasy. A lot of the books I'm talking about are fantasy because I was going randomly, because I'm in that mood today. So I will mention a writer and then say, but what sort of sources would they use to get the food? One of the things I have discovered, which disappoints me so much, is that most writers don't do intensive research into food for their novels. They don't work for 6 months developing a set of foodways that would operate entirely validly in their fiction. There are some of us who do, and we all know each other. We're all friends, and we talk food a lot, and we cook when we're together, which is not that often. But most people take the food in their fiction from stuff they already know, or books that are really easy to get hold of. So they have one reference point that they can just give examples of food, or they've seen TV series and said, oh, they had that food there. Yes, I can use this in my novel. Because for an awful lot of science fiction and fantasy writers, I find this very sad to admit. An awful lot of fiction and science fiction and fantasy writers do not take food seriously enough. So to show you just how seriously I take food, I have discovered, I went to the market this morning. It was Sunday morning. I normally go to the farmer's market on Sunday morning. So I got you an example of something that happens in Australia that does not happen elsewhere, that's food related, that should be put into science fiction books, novels, because it's perfectly science fictional, but never is. And I've pasted the link to that in the chat. It's an article about something that happened in December last year. It happens every year in December in the Kimberley region, which is the far northwest of Australia. Very isolated, very hot, very spectacular, and I have never been there and really should go. At the end of the mango season, a lot of mangoes fall off the trees. Mangoes tend to go alcoholic and parrots get drunk. And today at the market, there was a mango from the new mango season to the southeast. So different types of mangoes, different season. And this mango is, by happy coincidence, called a parrot mango because it looks like the parrots. You can see, doesn't it look like a parrot?
Exactly. Actually does.
It does. I chose one specifically that had that bit of green. So the parrot, it looks like, is local to me. It's a crimson rosella. So I have a mango that I'm waiting to get ripe because we've had too much rain for them to be ripe yet. and it looks like the parrots that are flying around outside when it's not raining. And these are not the same parrots that get drunk in the Northwest, but I thought it was a funny story. And this stuff doesn't often get into science fiction and fantasy novels because the parrot will. If you watch Star Trek, watch any science fiction TV thing, and when they want exotic fruits, they will take things that are normal fruit for me. So dragon fruit, I didn't buy any this morning, even though there was dragon fruit there, because it was white dragon fruit, and white dragon fruit is tasteless. It's just pure sweet. So I didn't buy dragon fruit, but it's often in trays of exotic foods when TV series want to show something exotic. They're not quite as exotic for anybody who lives in the tropics. I don't live in the tropics, but the top of Australia is very close to the equator, so we get a lot of tropical food. We don't normally in Canberra, and today was extraordinary because someone came from the coast, which is temperate but warm, and so we had mangoes, we had papayas, we had dragon fruit, we had avocados, and I only brought a pawpaw and, of course, the amazing parrot. It's going to fly away any minute. So most of the science fiction and fantasy we read exoticizes, but uses stuff from our everyday. If they want to write something with peasants, they'll write stews and potages. They don't actually know what peasants used to eat at any given time. They don't actually care. They're after a sense of what food should be. It's a concept rather than a reality. So no drunken parrots, even though drunken parrots would liven up most stories. So if they get the food from every day, and they don't get the food by doing this, I do a thorough think about food waste for each and all of my novels, but if most writers don't do that, what do they do? First of all, I'm going to start off with Anne Mccaffrey. Now I have this pile of books and they're not in order because I forgot to put them in order. So while I talk, I will find Anne Mccaffrey. So the thing about Anne Mccaffrey is that the Pern books, it's just that we'll just talk about the Pern books, have quite a bit of food in them. Food is important. You cannot go to a fair without getting bubble pies, and everyone talks about bubble pies. So, of course, I looked at the description of bubble pies and I worked out, oh, this is really straightforward. I can make this. Yay, let me make this. And I made what I thought was a bubble pie from the description. And then I got Anne Mccaffrey's cookbook. So Anne Mccaffrey has a very famous cookbook with a lot of the golden age science fiction writers contributed one or two recipes. And we're talking American golden age science fiction writers. And so the vast bulk of the recipes in this cookbook are really ordinary. And every one of them I went back to their book, to their novels and their short stories and said, I'm not sure I want to eat the food from their fiction anymore. So Anne Mccaffrey actually had the thing that she probably used as the base for her bubble pies in her cookbook. And for the audio recording, it's cooking out of this world. It's a recipe for beignets. So those lovely little fried French pastries, super light, super easy. Icing sugar on the top, except that she doesn't do that. She has, the ingredients are water, butter, onion, flour, and eggs. They're savoury beignet with no flavour except the onion. It's a very basic approach to cooking, which means that her bubble pies are more about the effect, the sense, the glory of them, than about a recipe. So I'll stick to my own inventions for it. And I'm happy to go through, if you have a favourite author from the period, I'm happy to look to find recipes for you later from this book. But I have to say that having been through it when I bought it, the only one I really loved was, there's a good recipe by Avram Davison, who is one of the best of the American short story writers of his generation. He has a really good hearty recipe that I would make myself. The rest of them, I'm really happy to talk about them. I don't use this book in my kitchen very often, which means Anne Mccaffrey is a good place to start because she wrote something that you want to eat, those bubble pies. But they have to come from your background, not hers, to make them really, really good. And now I'm making more piles and I won't be able to find anything at all in 5 minutes. So, oh, that's 2 whole paragraphs of my notes. I thought I'd go from the we have to make it up because the writer doesn't to something that writers actually know a lot about. There are a lot of Regency novels based on Georgette Heyer, influenced by Jane Austen. So basically early Napoleonic, not just Napoleonic if you're using the European definitions of time and space and not the English ones. But it was when George III of England went mad, when everyone wore pretty costumes. It was English costume drama, fantasy, basically. And a lot of writers are writing it right now. So Alison Goodman, I wrote down, and Patricia Reed's Alison Goodman's Dark Days Club, Patricia Reed's Sorcery and Cecilia. And these things are inspired by the Georgette Heyer, and I'll write her name. She did not write fantasy at all. She wrote comedy of manners with much romance. And they're very, 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 very popular books among writers because her writing craft was extraordinary. Her world building was so clever that anybody writing Regency romances doesn't use the historical world. They use her built world. But the thing is, she wasn't that much of a foodie. And lots of people who write Regency speculative fiction with magic, with vampires, whatever, tend to be a bit more foodie. And I know what books they use, and here I'm trying to find the critical one. I don't know what books they use. I know what type of food they use because I'm one of the people they ask about for it. And so this is the Jane Austen cookbook. There are 2 different types of Jane Austen. There are many versions of cooking in Jane Austen's time, and any book like that tends to be used by fiction writers who want to do that kind of setting. But this one is a bit different. The original recipes were from Jane Austen's family. The translations of those into modern recipes are really bad in this version. The editions of them are good, but there is, and I couldn't find my copy of it, a better, more recent volume, which is basically all of Jane Austen's family's foodways, all the things we've got written down for them. And that's the one that people ought to be using but are not. So they mostly use the Maggie Black I just showed you, or they use other cookbooks that have Regency food, that have food from Jane Austen's time. So not Regency food, from food from our actual real world. And the funny thing is, there are so many cookbooks that were published in England during that time. When I did a Regency Gothic banquet for Conflux, a science fiction convention in Canberra, I used an 1806 cookbook from London for a lot of the recipes because it was easier than, I used other sources as well. There were 2 Jane Austen family recipes in there, for example. But my favourite one was an 1806 London pub cookbook. So there's a truckload of primary sources, but most writers use just a couple of books, and they're often from Jane Austen's family. So there's this sense of we have this invented Regency magic stuff, and all the food talked about is mentioned by Georgette Heyer and comes from Jane Austen's family. Well, not quite all, but enough so that's the pattern, which is really fun because there's some really good food there if you like very fatty food. So what happened with the Maggie Black edition of Jane Austen's family recipes, it's actually her aunt's or something, is that they got rid of a lot of the richness because it really isn't very healthy food. but that was part of Southern English foodways. At the late 18th, early 19th century, the south of England was cow central. Everything was cheese, everything was butter. A cheesecake didn't have cheese in it, it was all butter. And everything was super rich. If you fried mushrooms, you were frying them in very thick cream, really yummy on toast. But, oh, you can't eat more than half a slice of toast with it on without feeling very full. So a lot of modern cookbooks change that and modify that. And if ever you want a menu for this kind of thing to do in Poland for a fun science fiction event, I can give you the one I did for the Regency Gothic banquet, because I've kept all my menus and all my recipes. So Regency Gothic is really straightforward. When you get a bit later, Gail Carragher's Parasol Protectorate or Marissa Doyle's Leland Sisters series, and I should type some of these down. So I mentioned Alison Goodman. I've mentioned, I'm glad I did notes. Patricia Reed. And now it's Gail Carragher. And it's Marissa Doyle. And Marissa Doyle is the same Marissa Doyle that did several editions of some of my books she worked on. She does a lot of really good support for other writers to help get our work seen and to help make it better. So she's one of these just really good people. Gail Carragher's Parasol Protectorate and Marissa Doyle's Leland Sisters series are a bit later than Regency. The Leland series starts in 1837. So there's one book I did not bring out from the bookshelf, because I could not be bothered, because it's bulky and it's boring. But it's the most known cookbook of the 19th century. Even though it would not have been available in 1837, it's a bit later. From the moment it was published, it became the cookbook that everybody got hold of it. And it has had so many editions. And a lot of people setting anything science fiction, whether it's steampunk, whether it's adventure fantasy, in the 19th century after Napoleon, so after the Regency, the two finished about the same date, more or less, give or take a year, tend to use Mrs. Beeton, even though she's not the right cookbook writer, because she's only good for later. And did I find an example of one that was earlier? I did not. I found an American example of one that's much later again. No, 1833. So this is if you're setting up magic in America in 1833, this is a reproduction. So this is what it actually looked like. This is my modern reproduction of The American Frugal Housewife, dedicated those who are not ashamed of economy. And it's full of social stuff. It's a really good reference for a writer, but very few writers use it, which I find deeply disappointing. And I did have another one, a book I prepared earlier. If anybody was using a London Jewish setting, the first English Jewish cookbook was 1846, which is perfect for some of these books. And it's again a reproduction. And I love this book, The Jewish Manual, or Practical Information in Jewish and Modern Cookery, with a collection of valuable recipes and hints relating to the toilette. The reason I love this book so much is partly this is my ancestry, because I am London Jewish on my father's mother's side. But also, the first Australian cookbook stole this and included it, just holus bolus. So if you're setting something in Australia in the late 19th century, so a late 19th century Australian steampunk, and you use Edward Abbott's magisterial 1860s odd book that was the first Australian published cookbook, It has a few Australian recipes and a lot of recipes stolen from other volumes, and this is one of them. And my great claim to fame in food history is I'm the person who discovered this. And I'm very disappointed with Mr. Abbott. So there are lots of possibilities for 19th century cooking because there are so many 19th century cookbooks, and most science fiction and fantasy writers don't use them. That doesn't mean we can't. Whenever I read the books, I will find authentic recipes that are correct for the time and place, even if the writer refuses to admit they're there. I think I annoy a lot of my friends who are writers by doing this, to be honest, but it makes me happy. Let's go back a bit further. Let's look at Harry Turtledove. Who doesn't like Harry Turtledove? Look, one of the reasons I like Harry Turtledove is not only is he a tremendous writer, not only is he also an historian, which is always a good thing, but if you follow him on Twitter, he makes excruciating puns. So he's one of the best of the big fat, he doesn't write big fat fancy, alternative history writers to follow. So if you read The Guns of the South, his food there is fairly authentic. He is an historian. But if you read his series that's got an alternate Roman history, The Lost Legion, with all sorts of interesting things, I need to ask him someday exactly what sources he used. I suspect he didn't use sources for the foodways. There are reasons why I want to ask, and they're to do with food history. So any food history, that any fiction that has Roman settings up to about the 2nd century, up to the 4th century, we don't have many cookbooks. In fact, we have the poetry of Cato, because Cato talks about food a lot, and lots of people have reconstructed food from Cato. And one of my favorite ancient Roman dishes is a reconstruction that I made from Cato's poetry. There's Anthemus, which is a bit later, but which is a dietary guideline. And there's this. Okay, this is not a modern French edition. Is it a modern French edition? Yes, it's a modern French edition. It's got the Latin, it's got French, because this was the best edition that was around when I was an undergraduate, postgraduate. Many years ago, it was the best edition around. The edition I wanted to buy was the edition my Roman history teacher talked about when he introduced us to Apicius. So Apicius was such a gourmand. He wrote down all the recipes, but he committed suicide when he was no longer super rich because he couldn't afford the most exclusive ingredients in the whole empire. It was not worth him living anymore. That means that it's a very good cookbook, but it wasn't written by him. It is the best compilation that exists of Roman cookery, but it's not the whole of Roman cookery. It's only a little part of it, and it reflects the person whose name is on it. So the reason I wanted another edition, even though this was the best at that time, I got the best one. I was sensible. It was because Professor Ridley told us that the other edition has an introduction. I checked it out, it indeed does, that Dr. Flowers and I tested every recipe in this book after Dr. Flowers' death. And yes, there are some things that one needs to own, and I haven't yet got that. So in terms of food, the reason a lot of these recipes don't appear in novels is because, honestly, ancient Roman cuisine through this cookbook is not particularly wonderful. It's better if you go through archaeological reports, because there's some really good foodways that are appearing from the digs at Pompeii and stuff like that. The archaeologists are showing us more about what ancient Romans in different parts of the empire actually ate. This is helpful, but for writers, it's not useful that way. Well, it's got flavors that we don't find congenial, so I don't use this as a cookbook, except when I have to. So I upset Roman historians every time I say this, every time. There aren't many sources for ancient food at all. There are more Jewish sources because the Talmud is full of food stuff. So if that ever gets pulled together, then we'll know a lot more about ancient foodways. But the assumption that Judaism is secondary in everyone's history means that that's been put to the side. There are a lot of really, really good books like this, and this is what most fiction writers of all kinds use. This book in particular, but there are half a dozen which are by academics. They don't have much, but they have what we know, and they make it very readable, and they have the recipes that we're more likely to be able to make that are less strange to our taste. I mean, there's a dessert in Apicius that's all full of apricot, and you think, how nice. Then you realise that it's got a thing that tastes like fish sauce as the main flavouring, so fishy apricot, which I find problematic. So this book, it doesn't modernise the recipes, it chooses the things that are useful for modern taste. And so a lot of fiction writers use it. This is the one that when people tell me they've been researching ancient Rome and they're using food in their writing, this is the one they always refer to. And they're very impressed with themselves because it's a very good study. But yeah, it's not a primary source, it's a modern compilation. So, Harry Turtledove. New Zealand, we haven't had any New Zealand writers yet, have we? Elizabeth Knox. So Elizabeth Knox, if you're going to read one book by her, you need to read, do you think I remember the title of it? It's got an angel in it. It's a very beautiful book. It's about wine. I should have, the things I know and then forget when I need to talk about them. But that's not what I'm talking about today. The books where foodways matter are her Dream Hunter books, which is a fantasy series, which is quite beautiful and very New Zealandy, and food plays a big part. And she uses 19th century and early 20th century New Zealand foodways, and she knows a lot about them just from her own background, so she doesn't have to invent. She just draws from what she knows. But there are two books which are the ones that if you ask a New Zealander, and I asked New Zealand fandom, what books do I need if I want to understand the difference between Australian cooking and New Zealand cooking? And they said, you need the Edmonds Cookbook and you need Aunt Daisy. Now, the Edmonds Cookbook was hiding from me, but here is Aunt Daisy. Aunt Daisy is this lady here. So she's not terribly young, or she wasn't terribly young 40 years ago. And she was basically the person who told everybody how to cook in New Zealand for many years. And her cookbook is classic, and the Edmonds is classic. And if you want to see where any New Zealand writer gets their foodways, these two books do the trick. Anything New Zealand comes from these, unless it's pre-European settlement. And there's very little New Zealand writing that's pre-European settlement, which is a shame, but it's the way it is. And these are, if you want to own a single Australian-New Zealand cookbook, I'd choose the Edmonds, because there's enough overlap between Australia and New Zealand for both to work, and it has very good recipes. I don't like their pavlova, though. Just saying. My pavlova is different. And I can't talk about books without talking and food without talking Terry Pratchett, because this is where we get a different thing. We all think we know the food in Terry Pratchett, but it's not based on what Terry Pratchett says about food. It's based on it's in a way, it's based on fandom, because everybody got so very enthusiastic about the food in Terry Pratchett. He actually wrote things that included the food. And I can bring up the Nanny Og cookbook. Which is very, very Terry Pratchett. And it explains at some point that he was writing it down off Fornaniog or something, so it keeps up the thing. It's also a very English cookbook. Even opening at random, dwarfish drop scones are actually just wholemeal drop scones with black food colouring. Let me analyse that quickly. And I know I'm not going to make foods. So drop scones are pikelets in Australia, or drop scones in Australia. We use both terms. They're basically a little baby pancakes that big, that are a bit thicker and a bit drier, that you eat with jam or with cream and jam or with butter. So they're an afternoon tea dish. So Nanny Og's cookbook is 100% modern English cookery. Not modern, not excitingly influenced by Indian food, but definitely modern. And the reason it's expressed the way it is because of the fandom element in cookbooks, because Pratchett's Discworld is pretty much has been shared equally by fandom for so long that it participated in the creation of foodways, which I think is wonderful. And as a medievalist, I have evidence that CMOT's Dibbler's food goes back to 12th century London, but that's another story. Another English writer is Dan Abner, who most of you may know for things other than his novels. He's really well known for all sorts of, comics, mostly, I think. But one of my favourite things is a novel by him called Triumph. I think that, I cannot type. Triumph. I hope I've got the spelling right. It's a comic satire of Elizabethan England. So whenever I think about it, I think, of course, Dan used Elizabethan cookbooks because they were around, they were available. And of course he did not. I have asked him this question and he ummed and ahed, so he might have, but if he did, it's a bit dubious. So just in revenge for him umming and ahhing, I've brought you a reproduction of an Elizabethan cookbook to prove it's dead easy to do this thing. And I have cooked bunches of things from here, and every time I have to squint because it's got the reproduction has the old letter face, which is really hard to read. But they're not as good as medieval cooking in England, but English cookery was still good in the 16th and 17th century. So this is Thomas Dawson's The Good Housewife's Jewel, and it's from 1596, so the late Elizabethan period, and very much the sort of thing that could have gone into a fantasy novel if Dan had known it existed, and we don't know that he did because he ummed and ahed. I will ask him again someday, don't worry. I can be very annoying about these things. Dan, I know he eats well. I know he and his wife both cook well. I don't know whether he cooks historical food. However, Chaz Branchley, who is another British writer who is now based in America, definitely. Remember I said there are a bunch of writers who are foodie, and friends of mine, he's one of them. We swap food stories a lot. He cooks more modern stuff, but he's always interested in the food history. So his food always has food that's appropriate for the settings. When he wrote as Daniel Fox, let me give you that, he wrote it was a Chinese type fantasy, but he actually lived in, I think, Taiwan for a fair while. And so he used the foodways that he'd learnt there. And when he wrote a medieval Middle Eastern thing, I'm pretty sure he did not use medieval Middle Eastern foodways. We've got some evidence of it. We've got this lovely Baghdadi cookbook, but I don't remember the recipes, and this could be my memory being at fault because it's a while since I've read them. The food seemed to be, from memory, more general Middle Eastern. So the sort of cookbooks that Chaz had access to, I found just one of them because it's the classic, Claudia Roden's A Book of Middle Eastern Food, which is a beautiful, beautiful cookbook book, and almost everything in it is worth making over and over again. And you can see, because it's really battered, I use this whenever I can't think straight and need to use a recipe. This is one of the cookbooks I'll go to. And this, even if he didn't use this cookbook or something like it, the food in it reflects the food in his series. And do you think I remember the name of his series? I cannot. I can remember where they are in the bookshelf, but that's the other room and not much use to you. And I'm going to do medieval. Oh, no, I'm not going to do medieval. If you ask me questions about medieval, I will not stop. I will talk for hours. So you can ask questions during question time if you want. And I wanted to make one really important point, which is we talked yesterday about a bit about the world being seen from our American eyes. A lot of our cultural world is shaped by American eyes. This means that American writers don't, some of them are wonderful and do get past it instantly and see things and just get it right. But a lot of them are still writing everything with an American influence. So the foodways are more New York than Paris when they're French, for example. So American writers and Australian and New Zealand writers, because of our cultural centricity and because of the advantage, the cultural advantage of being a native English speaker, tend to shape their foodways in general around stuff they already know. French science fiction and fantasy writers always shape their stuff around French stuff. So the way a culture sees food is going to affect the way the writer brings food into their fiction. So where does Poland fit in this? I don't know, because not enough Polish science fiction and fantasy has been translated into English. And the problem with the thing I know the best is the TV version of The Witcher, and that's not Polish in nature, it's Netflix in nature, which means it's got that English language influence, and the foodways are not reliably Polish, which is really sad. Because so if you want during questions, I'm happy to talk about because a lot of you are game people. I'm happy to move to actual techniques you can use to build a cuisine for a particular time and place, because that's the sort of thing I do a lot. But I have just one more. I have other cookbooks I can show you, but there's one you have to see. If you're writing, or the thing that most writers don't know is that the English language world, a lot of people wrote home journals with foodways as well as with recipes. It's not about published cookbooks. It's about private journals saying, and this food I got, that's where the Jane Austen food came from. It was from private journals. So I'm going to leave you with one of the best food studies books of a private journal I've come across. It's Eleanor Fetterplace's receipt book. So it's Elizabethan cooking, but written down by a family. And when guests came to stay, they wrote their favourite recipes. And this is when I discovered that Sir Walter Raleigh used tobacco in food, which I think is particularly noxious. So the name of the Middle Eastern cook, its author is Claudia Roden, and she's written a bunch of books and they're all good. The one that I waved was the one from my childhood, but the one I actually use the most is this big hefty tome, which I wasn't going to cart over. I mean, it's 3 meters. That's a long way to carry a book. So I will leave you with the thought that there's a bunch of stuff like Eleanor Fetterplace's receipt book, and that you can you can get hold of them because that's what food historians work with. But a lot of writers don't know that. So their novels don't reflect the actual food from the place because they don't know that there are sources they can get to discover the food from the place. And you can pretty much tell which writers talk to me because these are the things I send them to. And I'm very happy to have questions from now on, if you would like to ask questions. And I'm happy to see faces.
So as yesterday, if you're comfortable with speaking up, go ahead and simply speak up. If you prefer to type your question in chat, that's good as well. Let me scroll through chat, Gillian, and look for some questions there, because there were some stuff. Okay, there's one. Could you give a Google Scholar or ISBN address to your residency resources? I don't know if that was addressed during the talk.
Yeah, I use Google Scholar, but no, I don't use Google Scholar for food history. If you want a conference on foodways that has the history bent and is a lot of fun, and I wish I lived closer, I will type it in the chat, but it's the Oxford Symposium. And it's all about food. You turn up, you eat, you talk to chefs, you talk to food history people. And they've had it online, but Australia is really a not good place for English stuff online. If it's you can get half a day at the most. So there are a lot of places. Google Scholar is the place you go to when you've done your general research. It's not for it's to find specific volumes. There are a lot of historical cookbooks, the originals transcribed or the originals scanned in Google Scholar, but you have to know what you're looking for to find them. So I must have 400 downloaded from Google Scholar, but I know what I'm looking for. So go to the printed books first to work out what things are about. And then when you look at it, you can say, aha, that's what this is. And there's a really good American site, and I do not remember what it's called. So let me see if I can find it for you. And what's good about it is it has introductions to a lot of the main sources. No, I can't find it. It might not be there anymore. It might have disappeared. But I've found you an alternate, maybe. So a lot of major libraries have, for the reading public, introductions to food history, and that's probably the best first port of call. I'm a good port of call if you're designing a game that's set in 18th century England. You can find me on Twitter and say, what do you recommend I start reading with, or something, and that's dead easy. There are a lot of food historians who are way better than me. I just happen to be the one who's also a writer. So I'm not the best food historian in the world. I'm one of the most knowledgeable science fiction writers who's also a food historian, which is a very rarefied thing to be, isn't it? I'm not actually a food historian. I'm an ethno-historian, which means I specialize in all kinds of culture. But because so many people want to know food, I've specialized in that a bit more. And I cannot remember there was a really good US page that had descriptions of historical cookbooks and actually had the texts of the cookbooks, and I couldn't find it in Google just now. Pavlova is only awesome, by the way, because Alcaz pointed out pavlova. It's a giant meringue with fruit and cream topping.
I love it.
If you have a sweet tooth, you love it. If you don't have a sweet tooth, you say, who invented this crazy thing? I have found a way of making pavlova that I can eat, but you put coffee in the meringue and chocolate on top. And then fruit.
I absolutely love pavlova. I'm with Alco on this one. And my mother, she's a sweet person because she learned how to bake it, especially for me, for my birthdays. So, that's showing love.
So here, if you want to make a pavlova, most people do not go to the trouble of baking it. You go to the supermarket and buy a base.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I don't eat pavlova because it's just it makes my teeth ache. Unless you put coffee in the basic mixture and take away the sweetness. Then it's really nice. And that's the difference between being from the country that makes it. We will do terrible things to the famous food waste stuff and upset the world because we're destroying the thing they think is ours. But that's what we all do with our own culture, isn't it? It's ours, we're allowed to change it.
Yep.
If you have favourite fiction writers, I'm happy, if I know the work, I'm happy to tell you cookbooks. If I don't know the work, but I'm going to suggest that you type the names in the chat because it's just easier. It gives me a moment to think. I'm happy to wave my mango around again. Sorry.
I have a question because right now I'm running a campaign, an RPG campaign that's set in between the Great War and the Second World War, and it's happening in Southeastern Asia, which is like a region so unknown to me. And I have a group of foodies.
Which part of Southeastern Asia? What are the modern countries called?
Well, actually, the game is going to go from place to place because we're playing Broken Compass, which aims to. It aims to show things like in adventure movies when you go to one city, for example, Bombay. We're in Bombay right now, and you spend an hour there, and you go to Singapore, and then you go to Thailand, and whatsoever.
So there's some really good things between the wars in that region because that region is right next to my region, so I know it well. Foodways-wise, Malaya, which is now Malaysia and Singapore, was British. So you had all the local Malaysia, all the foodways you have from Malaysia now, but also a lot of English food. Indonesia has some Dutch influence and Portuguese influence, but especially Dutch. So in somewhere like Sumatra, but in Yogyakarta, they used to have, I think they still do, rich staffel, but so a Dutch type of way of serving food, but with Indonesian food. So you can use as a basis modern cookbooks from those places, but look for the European influence because it was stronger at that stage. And that's a quick cheats technique to get at it. Paulina, you had a question.
Paulina?
I just wanted to tell you that I'm about to leave because it's it's 5 minutes past our presentation time. So I can make Gillian or you, Veronica, a co-host, so you can take your time and have this panel over time.
Yeah, you can make me a co-host and then I will stop the recording then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Which means we can talk more about Southeast Asia if you want. So I don't know the precise cuisines for every single spot at all, but I know the general patterns because the colonialism didn't move out of the region until Malaya became Malaysia. It was really the 1960s that things started to change, which means that there was just a stronger European influence in certain spots. So you look for the port cities that were settled by Portuguese and by Dutch, and they will have Dutch influence. You look everywhere British, and they will have, Singapore is the perfect example, a lot of Cantonese food, because Cantonese food is the dominant Chinese, the Nyonya food, which is amazing, which is a mixed cultural thing. You've got Indian food and you've got Malaysian food. And So all of the things together in Singapore, and the balances changed over the years because Singapore's changed over the years, but it was a city an island that was very much British between the wars. So we call it between the wars. That's what the whole region calls it, between the world wars.
Okay.
The
That's good to
interwar
know as
period.
well. That will help
Interwar.
me with my research.
It means it's easier to look up.
Yeah. Thank you.
And there are some areas that were not influenced by colonialism at all at that time. Thailand is a story of its own. I'm just trying to remember when it came into the rest of the world. It was closed off for the longest time. It had military dictatorships in the interwar period. It had nothing much to do with the rest of the region, which is one of the reasons it's got significantly different foodways now. Vietnam was French, and they still have a lot of French influence. They still drink French coffee. So it was the period before colonialism left. So technically Australia was autonomous and independent, but in practice Australians didn't get citizenship as Australians until 1948, something like that. So we were this whole region not the whole region, Thailand was never colonized, but most of the region, the foodways looked back to Europe at that stage. They weren't European, well, except Australia and New Zealand. They're the more English countries, the ones that you associate with England now, like Australia, had more English foodways back then. But Singapore was just as much ruled by England, and Kuala Lumpur was just as much ruled by England. So what you had was a larger English influence. You had a public service that was much more British, and that meant that there was an influence on the food, which is really weird now I think about it. This is just common as mud for the region. It's something I've known since my childhood. So when you think of Europe, I think of Southeast Asia, Australia, ASEAN we call it. Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
It's not ASEAN, it's Australasia and ASEAN. We have different ways of describing it depending on what the context is, actually.
I will definitely keep that in mind. So thank you very much for that.
My pleasure. Singapore's a lot of fun because it still was a bit of a pirate town then, so it's worth investigating. Any other questions and thoughts?
Maybe a bit of a weird question and going more towards fantasy settings per se. But do you have any advice for figuring out recipes that would use made up on the spot ingredients that not necessarily exist in real life, and how to flavor it to make it both make sense when you look at it from a real life perspective, like I guess it would work, but at the same time this is not the fish that we have and probably not the same taste profile. So do you have any advice on how to work with something like that?
Yes, because this comes up in Australia a lot, because we have a whole lot of plants that the rest of the world doesn't have. And so I know what we do. We're only just in the process of bringing them into our cuisine. We've pretty much, there have only been 2 or 3 plants that are local. Macadamias have been used for a long time. Eucalyptus has been used. But we're surrounded by things that are not European, not North American, not from anywhere else, not even from New Zealand. We have unique plants. And so what we did as a country, I guess, or what Britain did when she settled and then we continued, was we labelled things to make them understandable. So I'm just trying to think of an example. There's this lovely little tasty thing which makes the best potato you will ever have, which we call bush tomato.
Okay.
It's a deadly nightshade, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. But it's got much more flavour than tomato. It's when you use it dried, you don't need anything else except butter to make the best baked potato you've ever had. We have we have native pepperberry. We have pepperberry. So it's a purple berry, very dark purple berry. And if you put it in rice, your rice will turn purple. It's got a beautiful, rich pepper flavour. And so we use it as a pepper, and we call it pepperberry. There's native mint, which is actually a prostanthera, which has got a lovely eucalyptusy underscent to its mint. It's a tree. It's not a mint. It's not related to a mint at all. But because it has a minty scent and taste, and you can use it a bit in recipes where you use mint as long as you allow for the extra flavours, we use it. We call it native mint. And if you look up bush food, we call it bush food or bush tucker. I'll write the bush tucker up because you'll see that there are maybe 200 plants now which are gradually come into use, and maybe a dozen of them we're actually using now. And some of them we're now giving them their own names, but most of them, so quandong, we call it quandong now, but we used to call it native peach. So what happens is you give it a name that fits the paradigm so you know how to use it. And then eventually it develops its own personality, and you can say, oh, but it's not a peach. It's never been a peach. We have to call it quandong. It's wrong to call it a peach. So that is useful and follow. Yeah.
This actually also kind of makes me wonder, do you guys ever use much, I guess, advice or resource from the actual natives? Because, I mean, it's not like Australia was completely uninhabited before getting colonized. So do you actually have access to some natives' recipes, and have you actually merged some of their recipes into your cuisine by any chance?
Yes and no, sort of. It's a bit complicated. First of all, Indigenous Australians were not fully regarded as human beings until the 60s. This means until recently, we have treated them really badly, really bad. Look up White Australia, look up stolen children, look up. It's not something that there are massacres, there is abuse, there's all sorts of things. What that's meant in terms of foodways is that a lot of the time we ignored, not me personally, thankfully, but we as a country, as a European country, ignored what people knew. So we'd develop our own recipes for kangaroos and not actually ask people what they did. So it's nothing like America, where a lot of big households with slaves had black cooks. And so the African American foodways became a part of American foodways. We're asking now, and there are still people who only met white European Australians. I know someone, I've met someone who, when he was 10, his whole family met their first European Australians. So we haven't lost everything, but it's really hard to ask someone what you do, what recipes their family use, when you've been so abusive. So it has to be done with respect. You don't just knock on someone's doors and say, I need your recipes, you're Indigenous. So the thing that's happening now is that there are actual tours you can do to learn ingredients and how they're used. There are experts who will teach, and that's how that is coming through. And you can buy a lot of the native ingredients not online, and 2 or 3 of the firms who sell them are owned by Indigenous Australians, and they will include recipes alongside them with them. And so I buy from them and get recipes. And there are cookbooks now that you can buy. And so the money from those cookbooks goes to the authors and the publishers. They're Indigenous firms. It's a way of keeping the thing about Indigenous Australians is they're custodians of the land. They have special understanding in a whole bunch of ways. This is nothing like, I don't think there's anything like it in Polish culture, because Poland has such a different history. So this means it's not a matter of whether these people have knowledge, it's a matter of whether we're entitled to know the knowledge. And the only people who can decide are the elders of a particular tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look for sources where approval has been given. So cookbooks, websites, not things that are not owned by white Australians. Things where it's very clear which country the people come from and what stuff they're talking about. They're not talking about all the foodways of Australia. They're talking about the Ngunnawal foodways, for example. And I'm living on Ngunnawal land, and I will type that. So we acknowledge the land we live on, who the traditional custodians of it are. And that means it's very easy to identify who to ask for permissions, or to look at a cookbook and say, okay, this has been given permission by this group. This is fine. We're not stealing. We're using with justifiably, understandably, properly. And this is quite new for Australia. We're developing a social conscience. A bit late. We should have developed it 2.5 centuries ago. But
To be honest, I was actually surprised. I didn't know that it was this late and this bad, to be honest. Then again, I haven't really known much about Australia in the first place, so this is interesting information in both the actual cooking front and the cultural front, because, again, I had no idea that this was what the situation actually looked like, whether when it came to the natives.
You'll
So
hear,
thank you for that.
you will hear it differently from different people. I am centre-left politically, and I have friends who are Indigenous, and I listen to them and I respect them, and that makes a difference. So I'm going to give you a title of the book. I edited a book of short stories where a whole bunch of writers wrote stories addressing cultural bias, and they're all Australian, although Lucy Sussex wrote a New Zealand story because she's dual culture. And one of the stories was by Yarachi Green, and I will give you her name. And she's very much Indigenous Australian.
Mm-hmm.
And she said if she was going to do a story, it had to be done properly with proper permissions. And it took 6 months to edit the story, because every edit had to go back to the elders for permission, because we were talking about cultural stuff that was privileged, and I wasn't allowed, even I as editor, wasn't allowed to see the stuff that decisions hadn't been made on.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved doing that because it taught me so much. I didn't get to talk to any elders for it yet. She dealt with them herself because they were her family. But I got to be part of the whole process and discover this is what happened before European invasion. This was the standard way of doing things. There was cultural maintenance every moment of every day by walking through the land, by telling stories. The song lines are all about that. There was maintenance of the land through the cultural maintenance. It was all very together and complicated and sophisticated. So seeing it operate in real life through the simple editing of a short story meant that I could see why it's not European at all and why it should never be Europeanized.
Mm-hmm.
But not everybody is. I was very privileged to have that experience. And I'd read the story, even if you don't want to read anything else in the volume, because the big sticking point, the thing we couldn't change, was that particular group, and that they live just south of Uluru, what used to be called Ayers Rock. They don't tell story with conflict in it. So we had to argue to get even a little bit of conflict in the story, and that was only possible because one of the characters was following white Australian patterns and dumping her own, and that was wrong, and there was a lot of explanation. The story was about her learning develop her own traditions. But it was incredibly uncomfortable for the elders to read the conflict. They said, you cannot tell tales like this. So their storytelling has different purpose to ours, has different meaning and stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, honestly.
Mm.
One thing that it kind of makes me think a little bit, it's a bit of a tangent, honestly, but when you mentioned, being sort of the keepers of the land, the problem with Europe when it comes to its history is that it developed far more robustly, I guess you could say, and kind of has been swept over well over a millennium ago.
Okay.
It depends on the region.
If I can, because we are still recording and we want to publish this talk afterwards. So if that's okay with you, I will stop the recording now as we, went off the main topic of the talk, and we will simply continue the discussion here. Is that okay with everyone?
Fine by me.
Yep.
Cool. So thank you, Gillian, very much. This talk will be published, I don't know, around a week or maybe 2 weeks from now on the internet, on our YouTube channel. So we will obviously send links to you. And thank you for this part.
I was going to sit back at one stage and show off my beautiful T-shirt.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's beautiful. I love this T-shirt.
Okay, so I'm stopping the recording.
Yep.